hoof and hooved. Before I made this video, I would have used hooved to describe an animal that has like just a big like toe, like, you know, like a horse. I'm gonna get onto it later on in the video. I'm not gonna just leave it as like it's just a big toe. I will cover what that actually is. But I would have used the word hooved to describe that animal, like a horse. But I put it in Word, and both of them were correct in Word. But then I looked it up, and apparently it's hoofed is the correct word to use, which made me think, in what scenario would you ever use the word hooved? You know, hooved. There's a different word called behooved. But what other scenario would you use it in? Does anybody know a scenario where you use the word hooved over hoofed? Anyway, back to those big toes. I swear that this is Pokemon relevant. As a kid, I always imagined that those big toes were like a toenail that kind of took over your foot. But like, I imagined it as a fungus. Like, I imagined that they were born without them, and then it slowly took over like their thing. And that's essentially what happened, but it happened over like millions of years during evolution. A hoof is essentially just keratin, the same thing that teeth is made out of. And that just happened, and basically one toe became way more dominant than all the other toes. Why this happened? Well, if you think of the animals that are hooved. Wait, was it? No, it was hoofed, wasn't it? If you think of those animals, they do a lot of standing and running, like horses and cows. So they needed it for speed, and also it's a lot sturdier than just having a foot. Feet get worn down. We call these animals ungulates. This video is about Pokemon ungulates. I should have made that clearer from the start. In the Pokemon world and in the real world, we divide these Pokemon into even and odd numbered toes. The Pokemon with odd toes are in a group called the, and bear with me here because this is a very difficult word to say, Perissodactylia. I think that's correct. When we say odd toes, that generally means 3 or 1 toe. Within this group, which I'm not going to say the name of again, we have the tapir, which is probably the weirdest looking animal in the world. Like, there's something about this guy that I viscerally hate. Pokemon actually has 2 tapirs, Hypno and Mashana, and if Hypno wasn't scary enough already, it becomes a lot weirder when you realize that its nose is essentially like a limb. Tapirs and elephants are some of the only animals with prehensile noses or trunks. This essentially means that they use it as a form to grab things with, and the idea of Hypno being able to grab me with his nose is terrifying. That will keep me awake. Before I made this video, I also found it really weird that Pokemon had 2 specific tapirs who both were centered around the idea of dreams or eating dreams or giving you dreams, and that these were created 20 years apart. Like, that just seemed really, really specific, like Dr. Doofenshmirtz levels of specific. However, I looked into it, and there is a Japanese kind of monster called a Baku, which is essentially like a tapir spirit that is very much involved with dreams, and this is kind of what both of these tapirs are based on. But it's really weird how it took us so long to get a dolphin, which is really big in pop culture, I would say, whereas we got 2 tapirs and they both had the same niche. And I know obviously Game Freak is a Japanese company, but it just seems very weird. So the tapir's 2 closest relatives are the horse, or horse-like animals, you know, like zebras. I say zebras. Take that, America. And also the rhino. And Pokemon's obvious rhino representative is Rhyperior. I've also grouped into this Nidoking and Nidoqueen. However, I want to talk about something I call Gen 1 Monster Syndrome. If you have a look at the Pokemon developed during Generation 1, they're a lot more basic, not in a bad way, but they're also a lot more kind of generic. Like, Seaking is a fish. Dugong is a dugong. They didn't even get creative with the name. They actually took the pun out of seal's name. Seal could have had the name Sea Ul, sea with an L, but they took the pun out of seal's name. That was a rant, side note. Nidoking and Nidoqueen generally have this in that they're very generic, and they are a rabbit, gorilla, rhino, porcupine thing. They could really go in any of these, but I don't really think that Nidoking is a rodent, so to say, so that kind of rules out the rabbit and porcupine aspects of it. I really struggle to say the word porcupine. Is it porcupine? Porcupine. Yeah. And I definitely don't think that Nidoking is enough like an ape to be a gorilla. So I think Rhino is probably the best way to go. It also looks a lot like Rhyperior. I'm saying just Nidoking, but I also mean Nidoqueen when I'm talking about this. I could probably be convinced. So if you're in the Nidoking is a porcupine fan club or something, let me know, because I might be convinced. After this, we move on to the more equine Pokemon, which includes obviously Zebstrika. Americans, why don't you call it Zebstrika? Checkmate. We also have Mudsdale, who is obviously a type of Clydesdale horse, which is a big, like, kind of Scottish horse. Very well known for, like, they pull things and carry things, They're big and sturdy. That's why it has the ability Stamina. We also have Glastria and Spectria, who are Destriers. And I only knew what a Destrier is because I've read all of A Song of Ice and Fire, which is very difficult to say, by the way. Destriers are kind of horses bred specifically for, like, knights, and they're, like, these huge, like, really strong horses, and they always talk about Destria, and I got so confused while reading the book that I had to look up what one is. I've also put in this group the many unicorns of Pokemon. We obviously don't have real unicorns in real life that we know of, but Pokemon does. And Keldeo and Rapidash are very clearly unicorns, and they're very clearly horse-like, so I put them here. So that basically concludes all of the odd-toed ungulates, but the even-toed ungulates is by far the largest grouping. We call them Artiodactylia. When we're talking about things that have the word like dactyl in it, like pterodactyl, that normally relates to the number of digits that you have. So if you are born with extra fingers, we call that polydactylia. The first of this group is Camerupt, who is obviously a camel. Pokemon's design for Camerupt is a lot more cow-like. He's probably the closest thing to a Highland cow in the Pokemon world, but it's definitely a camel. I'm not going to say that Camerupt isn't a camel. A key theme in the even-toed ungulates is that their diet plays a really, really key role in determining what type of animal they are. So the Suidae are pigs, and they're famously omnivores. Pig will eat anything you give it. As a result, they have incisors and large canine tusks. I always struggle to say those words where it's like, it sounds like you have to do an echo. Tusks, crisps, They probably don't come out well on here because it's the S sounds doesn't come out well, but they're very difficult to say. Pigs also generally have 4 toes compared to the much more common 2 toes that most even-toed ungulates have. Pokemon's pigs are obviously Emboar, who is a boar, as well as Oinkologne and Grumpig, who are generally just more generic pigs. After this, we move on to the kind of herbivore ruminants of the Pokemon world. And I'll explain what a ruminant is. It essentially means that they have an extra stomach compartment where they can ferment their food, and then they kind of bring that back up to chew again, and that's called cud. And it essentially means that they can get extra nutrients and the most from their food. So if you think Farigiraf has this ability called Could Chew. As a kid, I always thought that giraffes were much more horse-like, but I guess I was wrong. The group also includes the 2 cervids of the Pokemon world, and cervids are essentially deer. And this is obviously Weirdeer and Sawsbuck. We then get the bovines, and I always thought that bovines were just cows. Like, I thought that the word bovine related to just cows and bulls, obviously. But it actually includes sheep, goats, and antelopes, which, on a side note, would be an amazing like prequel to Planes, Trains, and Automobiles set in like the medieval times. Somebody can get on making that. In the cow department, we have Miltank and Tauros, but also Buffalant, because in North America, cows developed a little bit differently and gave us the buffalo. There's an amazing CPG Grey video. I will link it in the description. But he talks about how the idea of America not having cows is so important to like the differences in development between the old world and the new world. It's amazing. I would definitely watch it. If you like this kind of thing, it's an amazing video. There's also 2 cow adjacent Pokemon. So Terrakion is very bull-like with its big horns and its aggressive nature. So I'd probably put it with a cow. And I would also say Volcanion is very front heavy, like what you see with bulls, and has a very bull-like shape, and maybe even has a bull ring on its back. I don't think it fits anywhere else, so it's going here. Going back to the Swords of Justice, the other 2 were very difficult to place. I eventually went with them being antelopes, because Virizion and Cobalion don't look that much like deer. I always thought of them as deer, but then I actually thought about it, and I was like, they look like antelopes. Yeah? Does that make sense? This leads us on to the Capridae, which are like Capricorn. You know, they're not bulls. It's goats and sheep. These are all pretty obvious in the Pokemon world. Dubwool and Ampharos are the 2 sheep, and Gogoat and Indeedee are the 2 goats of the Pokemon world. From here we go back up the tree to the ungulates that adapted to live in water, the hippos and the cetacea. Hippos are herbivores, which is very weird when you consider that they're famously really deadly. A hippo will kill you, it just doesn't want to eat you. Hippowdon is obviously a hippo, but I've also put the slow twins here. Like Nidoking and Nidoqueen, they have Gen 1 monster syndrome. They could be salamanders, you know, you chop their legs off and they come back, not their legs, their tails. They could be manatees, they look like manatees, or they could be otters. They also look like really big otters. So I did the girlfriend test where I showed my girlfriend a picture and she said that's a hippo. The cetacea are those animals that are entirely adapted to water. They're generally carnivores and eat things like krill and other small aquatic animals of that ilk. Until recently, it was just Wailord. However, Generation 9 gave him some friends. He got Palafin and Cetitan to play with. You might think, where is Kyogre here? But I've generally left box art legends off here because they're essentially gods. I put Zamazenta and Zacian on here because they're not. But the ones like Kyogre, who is literally like, he's the primordial personification of the sea. I just don't think that he's related to Wailord or something. I think that they are more of a force of nature rather than just a big whale, you know? So, that was it. Those were the ungulates of Pokemon. I've tried doing this a little bit more free-flowing, and it's probably got a bit more rambly, if you like that. I certainly liked it. I had a lot more fun. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask, or any recommendations. Thank you. Goodbye.